not to be confused with the present-day community Port-Royal, Annapolis County, Nova Scotia. A Port-Royal National Historic Site. Port-Royal was founded in 1632, almost 20 years after Habitation at Port-Royal was destroyed. For most of the period until the Siege of Port-Royal by the Kingdom of Great Britain in 1710, the village was the capital of Acadia. Port-Royal was the primary Acadian settlement until Acadians migrated out of the community to Pisiguit, Cobequid, Grand Prix, and Beaubassin in the 1680s. Context: the Habitation at Port-Royal was established on the other side of the river by Samuel de Champlain and Pierre du Guadamont in 1605, and it lasted until 1613. Scottish colony during the Anglo-French War under Charles I. By 1629 the Kirks took Quebec City. Lord Ochiltree planted a colony on Cape Breton Island at Baleine, and William Alexander established the first incarnation of New Scotland at Port-Royal. This set of British triumphs, which left only Cape Sable as the only major French holding in North America, was not destined to last. In 1621 King James I of England granted to Sir William Alexander all of Nova Scotia, which then included New Brunswick. On July 28, 1629, Sir William and 70 Scottish settlers were established at Port-Royal. During this time there were few French inhabitants in the colony. In 1629, Sir William sent a ship and some settlers who built Charles Fort at Port-Royal, close to the site of Fort Anne. In 1631, under the terms of the Treaty of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, the colonists were ordered to abandon Port-Royal to the French. The official handover did not take place until late in 1632, and this gave Captain Andrew Forrester, commander of the then Scottish community, the opportunity to cross the Bay of Fundy with 25 armed men and raid Charles de Saint-Étienne de La Tour's Fort Ste. Marie at St. John, New Brunswick. In 1633, protecting the boundary of Acadia, Charles de La Tour, the French commander of Acadia, made a descent upon Machias, Maine from his seat at Port-Royal, killing 2 of its 6 defenders, and carrying the others away with the merchandise. The French then established Fort Ste. Marie de Grace as the capital on the Lafave River before re-establishing Port-Royal, French colony. In 1635, governor of Acadia Charles de Manu d'Aulnay de Charnisy moved settlers from present-day Lafave, Nova Scotia to Port-Royal, and the Acadian people began to establish their roots. Under d'Aulnay, the Acadians built the first dikes in North America and cultivated the reclaimed salt marshes. During this time, Acadia was plunged into what some historians have described as a civil war. The two main centres were Port-Royal, where d'Aulnay was stationed, and present-day St. John, New Brunswick, where Charles de Saint-Étienne de La Tour was stationed. Acadian Civil War Battle of Port-Royal. Charles de Saint-Étienne de La Tour arrived from present-day St. John, New Brunswick, and attacked Port-Royal with 2 armed ships. D'Aulnay's captain was killed, while La Tour and his men were forced to surrender. In response to the attack, d'Aulnay sailed out of Port-Royal to establish a blockade of La Tour's fort at present-day St. John, New Brunswick. Battle of Port-Royal in 1643, La Tour tried to capture Port-Royal again. La Tour arrived at St. John from Boston with a fleet of 5 armed vessels and 270 men and broke the blockade. La Tour then chased d'Aulnay's vessels back across the Bay of Fundy to Port-Royal. D'Aulnay resisted the attack, and 7 of his men were wounded and 3 killed. La Tour did not attack the fort, which was defended by 20 soldiers. La Tour burned the mill, killed the livestock, and seized furs, gunpowder, and other supplies. D'Aulnay ultimately won the war against La Tour with the 1645 siege of present-day St. John, New Brunswick. After the siege, La Tour went to live in Quebec. After defeating La Tour at St. John, from the capital Port-Royal, Olney administered posts at La Have, Nova Scotia, Pentagoet, Canso, Nova Scotia, Cap Sable, the St. John River and Miscou Island. After de Olney died, La Tour re-established himself in Acadia, English colony. Battle of Port-Royal. In 1654, Colonel Robert Sedgwick led a force to capture Port-Royal made up of 100 New England volunteers and 200 professional soldiers sent to New England by Oliver Cromwell, the first professional English soldiers sent to North America. Prior to the battle, Sedgwick captured and plundered present-day Castine, Maine and La Tour's fort at present-day St. John, New Brunswick. Sedgwick also took La Tour prisoner. The defenders of Port-Royal numbered only about 130. After resisting the English landings and defending the fort during a short siege, the outnumbered Acadians surrendered after negotiating terms that allowed French inhabitants who wished to remain to keep the property and religion. Soldiers and officials were given transport to France while the majority of Port-Royal residents remained unharmed. However, in violation of the surrender terms, Sedgwick's men rampaged through the Port-Royal monastery, smashing windows, doors, paneling and even the floorboards before burning the monastery and the newly constructed Port-Royal church. The English occupied Acadia for the next 16 years with a small garrison, leaving the Acadian residents mostly undisturbed. French colony. In 1667, Port-Royal was returned to France with the Treaty of Breda. In a census taken in 1671 there were 361 Acadians in the Port-Royal area. During King Philip's War, Jean de Labat was governor of Acadia. Another census in the late 1680s shows 450 Acadians in the entire area of Port-Royal. King William's War. Battle of Port-Royal. During King William's War, Port-Royal served as a safe harbor for French cruisers and supply point for Wabanaki Confederacy to attack the New England colonies encroaching on the Acadian border in southern Maine. The Battle of Port-Royal began on May 9. Sir William Phipps of New England arrived with 736 men in 7 English ships. Governor de Meneville fought for 2 days and then capitulated. The garrison was imprisoned in the church and Governor de Meneville was confined to his house. The New Englanders leveled what was begun of the new fort. The residents of Port-Royal were imprisoned in the church and administered an oath of allegiance to the king. Phipps left, but warships from New York arrived in June, which resulted in more destruction. The seamen burned and looted the settlement, including the parish church. Raid on Port-Royal. In response to assisting Pierre Maisonnard de Baptiste, English frigates attacked Port-Royal. The New Englanders burned almost a dozen houses and 3 barns full of grain. Port-Royal was again made the capital in 1699. Queen Anne's War. During Queen Anne's War, there was a New England blockade of Port-Royal and then 3 attempts to lay siege to the capital. The last siege ultimately resulted in the British conquest of Acadia and Nova Scotia. Blockade of Port-Royal. In 1704, in retaliation for the raid on Deerfield, Major Benjamin Church created a blockade of Port-Royal. Church was instructed not to attack the capital because the action was not authorized from London. Before daylight, on July 2, 2 English warships and 7 smaller vessels entered the Port-Royal basin. They captured the guard station opposite Goat Island as well as 4 Acadians. Landing at Point Auchesnes on the north shore, they took a family prisoner. A woman from the family was sent to the fort to demand its surrender. The blockade lasted 17 days. Those in the fort awaited an attack. Church had moved on to conduct the real purpose of his expedition, the raid on Grand Pre-Acute, raid on Pisiguit, and raid on Jean. He returned to Port-Royal and then, with a brief exchange of gunfire, returned to Boston. Siege of Port-Royal. Two major British efforts to besiege the town in 1707 met with failure. The first siege during the war happened on June 17 and lasted 11 days. Colonel John March, the most senior officer in all of Massachusetts, was sent to defeat the capital. Acadian Governor Daniel Darger de Subercase successfully defended the capital. Siege of Port-Royal. Colonel Francis Wainwright led the second siege on August 20. It lasted 11 days. Subercase and his troops killed 16 New Englanders and lost 3 soldiers. Again the British retreated. Siege of Port-Royal. On September 24, 1710, the British returned with 36 ships and 2,000 men, and again laid siege to the capital in what would be the final conquest of Acadia. Subercase and the French held out until October 2, when the approximately 300 defenders of the fort surrendered, ending French rule in Acadia. The following year, after the Acadian and Indian success at the nearby Battle of Bloody Creek, the Acadians and Indians unsuccessfully attempted to lay siege to the capital, British colony. After the conquest of Acadia with the Siege of Port-Royal in 1710, the British changed the name from Port-Royal to Annapolis-Royal. The French, MIKMAQ, and Acadians made 4 attempts to retake the capital of Acadia during King George's War. Many of the Acadian inhabitants at Port-Royal remained in the town after it became Annapolis-Royal. However, during the French and Indian War, the British deported the Acadian residents at Annapolis-Royal to British and French territories in the expulsion of the Acadians, beginning in 1755. Because they wanted to remove any military threat the Acadians posed and cut off vital supply lines the Acadians provided to the French fortress of Louisbourg. Demographics.